Ever feel like everyone's tossing around the word fundamentalism, but nobody's really unpacking it? Well, get ready, because today we're taking a deep dive into that. We're going to explore the why behind intolerance, where it comes from, and, the historical stuff we need to understand.
And you hit the nail on the head. What's fascinating is how this crosses all these different religions, right? We're not just talking about one faith here.
Right. It's about seeing the common threads.
Exactly. And the work we're looking at today by scholar Tony Mubarak, he connects the dots between, get this, Judaism, Christianity, and Islam.
I mean, talk about ambitious. So how does he even start to tackle a topic this big?
Well, Mubarak lays some serious groundwork. He goes right for these key definitions like fundamentalism itself, radicalism, even hyper-fundamentalism. He wants to make sure right from the get-go we're all understanding these terms the same way.
Which is crucial because, let's be real, those words get thrown around so casually sometimes. It's like, okay, but what are we really talking about?
Exactly, and that's his point. It's not as simple as just having strong beliefs, right? It's about what happens when those beliefs get so rigid, so unquestionable, that they're used to justify treating others badly.
Okay, yeah, that's where things get dicey.
Yeah.
So what are some of those, warning signs, the red flags of radical fundamentalism that he talks about?
He points out these three major similarities, and it's wild how consistent they are, no matter which religion we're analyzing. So first up, you've got this unwavering, gotta take it literally approach to Scripture. And often it's without any regard for what those texts meant in their historical context.
So like someone taking the phrase, an eye for an eye, totally out of context and running with it.
Precisely. And that actually leads right into the second similarity, which is the need for a strong, often authoritarian and almost always male leader figure. This person becomes the one who dictates the correct interpretation.
Uh-oh, so no room for debate there.
Not so much. And of course, anyone who dares to question is seen as a threat to the whole system.
So you've got this pressure cooker situation. Rigid interpretations, charismatic leader claiming to have all the answers. Where does the third similarity fit in?
This is where it gets really dangerous. It's the belief that their view is the only AY valid one. Like no ifs, ands, or buts. Interfaith dialogue, forget about it. Even acknowledging that other paths to truth might exist is a no-go.
And that's where the potential for real harm comes in, right? Mubarak's point is, if you are absolutely convinced that you have the only YY truth, well, anyone who disagrees isn't just wrong, they're an enemy.
Exactly. And that, my friend, is a slippery slope. You start justifying intolerance, discrimination, and in some extreme cases, even violence.
It's chilling how easily that can escalate. Now, Mubarak makes a really interesting distinction. He says this isn't just some kind of theological problem. This is a spiritual one that shows itself as intolerance.
Right, and that's huge.
So can you break that down a little bit more? What does he mean by that?
He's getting at the idea that people who are drawn to this kind of black and white, intolerant worldview, they often find a weird sort of comfort in it. It simplifies everything, gets rid of nuance, ambiguity, all that stuff that makes people uncomfortable.
Yeah, who wants to deal with the gray areas,
right?
It's way easier to have everything neatly sorted.
Right. But here's the thing, true spirituality. It's about wrestling with those gray areas. It's about leaning into the unknown, embracing those messy contradictions. It's harder, for sure, but ultimately way more rewarding.
It's like anything else, right? The real growth comes from challenging yourself. But okay, so how does all of this connect to, actual history?
Well, that's where it gets really interesting. Mubarak takes this deep dive into first century Judea, under Roman occupation.
Okay, so we're talking serious culture clash here. The Roman Empire, famous for, shall we say, their love of a good gladiator match, and the Jewish people for whom, even breaking the Sabbath to save a life wasn't just allowed, it was practically a requirement.
You got it. Talk about a recipe for tension, right? You've got the Romans, violence is entertainment, it's a tool, it's how they exert control, totally at odds with the Jewish emphasis on the sanctity of life.
And remember, this isn't just some abstract philosophical difference. This is everyday life under Roman rule. Taxes, forced labor, and the constant threat of, let's just say, Roman persuasion if you step out of line.
Oh, yeah. And that pressure cooker is where groups like the Essenes come in. These guys saw the Romans as straight-up enemies of God. And they weren't afraid to back that view with some, let's call it, creative interpretations of their scriptures.
Yeah, we've all seen how easily scripture can be twisted to fit an agenda.
Mubarak's analysis of their commentaries is fascinating. They were taking passages that, in their original historical context, might have meant something totally different. And they were using them to justify this intense hatred for the Romans.
Talk about cherry picking.
Right. And they weren't the only ones playing this game. You've also got the Zealots, the OG radicals. These guys were notorious for, let's just say, taking matters into their own hands. Daggers, torches, robberies, you name it.
So we're talking full-on rebellion.
Oh, absolutely. They wanted Roman rule gone, and they weren't too picky about the methods. And their story is like a giant warning sign about the danger of using a literal interpretation of Scripture to justify violence. Because in their minds, they were fighting a holy war. The ends justified the means.
It's easy to see how things can spiral out of control when you start believing that, which makes, Jesus' message of love and forgiveness all the more radical, right? This is a guy living in a time of intense oppression, hatred everywhere, and he's preaching compassion for your enemies.
It's mind-blowing when you really think about it. You can't fully grasp how radical Jesus' message was without understanding the historical context. He was directly challenging the dominant ideologies of his time, the powers that be.
He was calling for a complete overhaul of the system. Love as resistance. It really makes you think about how easy it is to misinterpret scriptures, especially when you're looking for a way to justify, violence or hatred. So how does Mubarak suggest we navigate this whole, power, justice, and love thing? Where do we even start?
He uses this really thought-provoking example from the Old Testament, the story of King David buying the threshing floor. Now, David, at this point, he's king, right? He could have easily just taken this land he wanted for God's temple, but he insists on purchasing it.
Wait, that rings a bell. Refresh my memory, though. What's the big deal about David buying the land? It's his kingdom, isn't it?
So David wants to build this altar to God, right? And he finds this perfect spot. It's a threshing floor owned by a guy named Araunah. Now, Araunah, he's probably a little intimidated, right? The king wants your land. So he's like, please, your majesty, take it. It's yours. No charge. In fact, here's some oxen, some supplies, whatever you need for a proper sacrifice.
And David's like, whoa, 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 hold your horses.
Exactly. David's response is basically, nope, not how we do things. This is for the Lord. It has to be done right. I'm paying for it.
That's amazing. He wouldn't accept a freebie, even for something as important as a holy site.
Nope. And Mubarak points to this story as highlighting something so crucial, especially about leadership. It's not enough to have power. You have to use it justly, ethically. You have to lead with righteousness, not just might.
Man, that's powerful, especially in today's world, where it seems like power often trumps everything else.
Yeah.
But, okay, so how do you reconcile that? The idea of always acting justly, even when you have the power to do otherwise, with the very real need for justice when someone's been wronged.
That is the million-dollar question, isn't it? And that's where Mubarak throws down the gauntlet. He says we have to grapple with forgiveness. And he's not talking about some, warm, fuzzy feeling.
Yeah, not just letting bygones be bygones.
Right. He's talking about empathy on a whole other level, really putting in the effort to understand where the other side is coming from, even when, and this is key, even when you don't agree with them.
Easier said than done, right? Especially when we're talking about historical injustices, deep-seated pain, generations of trauma.
Oh, absolutely. And Mubarak acknowledges that. He's not saying to ignore suffering or pretend it didn't happen, not at all. But what he's suggesting is that true reconciliation, the kind that leads to lasting peace, it can only grow from that soil of understanding. And ultimately, it requires forgiveness.
It makes me think of that line he uses. It's something like, it's not only the persecuted who suffer, the persecutors, they suffer too.
Man, that one hits hard. It forces you to consider the burdens, the scars, that even those we consider the winners in any conflict, they carry that with them too. And we forget that so easily. You get caught up in who's the victim, who's to blame.
It's that us versus them mentality.
Exactly. And that's why Mubarak stresses the importance of forgiveness, not just for the other side, but for ourselves too, to break free from those cycles of pain and resentment.
He uses some really strong language to describe this whole thing. He says, we got to ditch the legal model, the whole weigh and balance, tit-for-tat approach. We need to move toward grace, that unmerited, undeserved favor.
Yeah, it's a whole different paradigm, right? And his argument is we can't expect God's forgiveness if we're not willing to extend it to others.
It's like this chain reaction, a ripple effect. You forgive, and maybe, just maybe, that opens the door for someone else to do the same.
Exactly. It's a cycle of love and understanding.
Wow. So much to unpack here, but it feels incredibly relevant to every conflict happening in the world today, don't you think?
100%. It's a call to action. It's about walking the walk, not just talking the talk. Because in the end, our actions speak way louder than words ever could.
Mubarak's saying forgiveness isn't just some religious ideal. It's a tool for real, tangible change. For ourselves, for our communities, for the whole world.
Absolutely. And he reminds us that as people of faith, we have this responsibility to speak out against injustice, yeah, but to do it with love, with compassion, to be voices for peace and reconciliation in a world that desperately needs it.
You know, we've covered so much ground here. We've talked about the common threads across different faiths, the historical context of conflict, the dangers of rigid interpretations, and, of course, how vital forgiveness is if we ever want to achieve peace.
It's a lot to process, for sure, but this is a conversation we all need to be having.
It really is. This is what a deep dive is all about, right? Challenging ourselves to think critically, to question our assumptions, to consider that maybe, just maybe, our way of seeing the world isn't the only way. And that's a good thing.
It's huge, because it's by truly understanding the roots of intolerance, by confronting those ugly parts of ourselves and our history, that we can even begin to imagine a different future. A future where love and understanding, not hatred and division, are the driving forces.
So, as we move into the final part of our deep dive, keep these questions in mind. How can we be more empathetic in our understanding of other faiths and their histories? How do we challenge intolerance in our own communities? And most importantly, how can we embrace forgiveness as a path to peace and reconciliation? You know, thinking back on everything we've discussed, it really gets you thinking about how we deal with conflict, right? Not just the big stuff happening in the world, but even in our own daily lives. And Mubarak talks about this idea of what he calls listening love. And that really stuck with me.
Yeah, it's powerful, isn't it? He's saying that before we can even begin to bridge those divides, one of the most important things we can do is actually listen to the other side, like really listen.
It's not just about hearing the words.
Right, not at all. It's about trying to understand their perspective, their history, their pain. Even, and this is huge, even if you don't agree with them.
It's like you were saying earlier, everyone has a story. And those stories deserve to be heard, not dismissed, not debated, just heard. And that's where real empathy starts to grow.
100%. It's about going beyond our own little bubbles, you know, our preconceived notions, our biases, being open to the possibility that, hey, maybe we don't have it all figured out. Maybe there's something new to learn.
That takes humility, for sure, to admit that our own understanding might be incomplete.
It does. And, you know, Mubarak even talks about how in interfaith dialogue especially, it can be more helpful to focus on common ground than to get bogged down in those theological debates.
Oh, yeah, he calls it the stair-step approach, right? Where each tradition basically sees itself as one step closer to the truth than the others.
Exactly. And he argues that kind of thinking, it just leads to division and judgment. It's like this never-ending competition of who's right and who's wrong.
So what's the alternative? How do we break out of that cycle?
Mubarak says we got to start by finding those points of connection, shared values, shared experiences, shared humanity, and use that as the foundation for building those bridges.
Because when we can see each other as fellow human beings, flaws and all, not just as representatives of some opposing ideology, it becomes a lot harder to demonize each other, right?
100%. Dehumanization thrives on distance, but the closer we get, the more those walls start to crumble.
And that seems to be Mubarak's main call to action, isn't it? To reject those easy us versus them narratives that are always being thrown at us, to embrace the beautiful, messy complexities of our shared humanity. In fact, he even challenges this whole idea of loving your enemy as being too simplistic.
Right. He's saying that in a world saturated with hate and violence, just telling people to love each other isn't enough. It's got to go deeper than that.
So how do we actually do that? How do we put that into practice? What are some tangible things we can do as individuals, as communities, to start bridging those divides and building a more peaceful and just world?
Well, Mubarak offers a few concrete suggestions. First off, he stresses the importance of education, learning about different faiths, different cultures, engaging in respectful dialogue, and, crucially, challenging our own prejudices.
That's something we can all do, no matter our background or beliefs. Just that willingness to be curious, to ask questions, to try and understand the world beyond our own limited experience.
Exactly. And hand in hand with that, he emphasizes the importance of building relationships, reaching out to people from different backgrounds, having those meaningful conversations, finding that common ground. Because, let's be real, it's a lot harder to hate someone you know and understand.
It's about humanizing the other.
Yeah.
And ultimately, it all comes back to that radical act of forgiveness, letting go of past hurts, choosing to see the humanity in those who have wronged us, and then working together to create a future where those wrongs aren't repeated.
It's not easy, not by a long shot. But as Mubarak reminds us, it's really the only way to break those cycles of violence and hatred that have plagued humanity for far too long.
It's the path to true, lasting peace. Well, this deep dive has been, to say the least, thought-provoking. We've explored the dangers of religious extremism, the historical context of conflict, and of course the incredible power of empathy, understanding, and forgiveness as pathways to peace. But now it's your turn. What were your takeaways? What really resonated with you? Let's keep this conversation going in the comments. Until next time, stay curious, stay engaged, and keep asking those tough questions.